The sound of sirens was growing closer. Jake glanced over his shoulder, sweat dripping from his forehead as his fingers moved over the vault's panel. The chaos around him was overwhelming, but he had to stay focused. The vault in front of him was legendary, considered unbreakable by all experts. All except for him. Time was running out, and each lost second intensified the tension in the air. How much longer? Donnie, a shadow beside him, asked anxiously, as usual. His hands trembled as he gripped his gun, ready for anything unexpected. Jake ignored the question, his eyes locked on the small green screen in front of him. 3 numbers, that was all that separated him from opening the vault or failing completely. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he knew that letting the adrenaline take over would be his fatal mistake. He had to keep control. The room around them was a security chamber isolated in the heart of a high-tech bank. They had temporarily disabled the alarms, but not for long. Jake knew the police would be there in a few minutes, maybe even less. The distant sound of the sirens confirmed it. He took a deep breath, and then, the final number appeared on the screen. A faint click echoed, and the heavy vault door began to slowly open. Donnie gasped beside him, already expecting piles of money or glittering jewels. But when the door finally revealed its contents, what they found was something completely unexpected. Inside the vault, on a glass platform, there was only an old journal and a small bronze key. Jake frowned, carefully picking up the journal as if the object could reveal its significance just by touch. Donnie looked at him, confused. "What the hell is this?" "Where's the money?" he whispered urgently, frustration evident in his voice. Jake didn't answer right away. Something about the journal drew him in. He opened it, quickly flipping through the yellowed pages. There was no money, no jewels, just a series of notes and rudimentary maps, like a logbook of some ancient explorer. The key seemed to complement the journal, with a symbol engraved on it that matched what Jake had just seen on one of the pages. Donnie's confusion deepened, but Jake knew there was something more important here. Something that wasn't immediately visible. Forget the money. He hesitated, closing the journal abruptly and shoving it into his backpack. "We need to get out of here. Now." They both knew time was running out. Jake grabbed the key, and they bolted from the chamber. The warehouse around them was dark, their footsteps echoing far too loudly for Jake's comfort. The sirens were even closer now, and they had little time before they'd be cornered. Running through the narrow hallways of the bank, the sound of their own footsteps grew louder, like an echo of the minutes they were losing. They knew that if they didn't leave soon, they'd be trapped. Jake glanced at Donnie, who already looked like he was on the edge of a breakdown. The heist had been planned for months, and now, with the vault's contents so unexpected, the pressure was causing everything to unravel. They reached the back door, where another member of the crew, Ralph, was waiting for them. He opened the door quickly, and the 3 of them dashed into the dark alley, where a black van was parked, ready to whisk them away. Ralph looked expectantly at Jake, waiting for an explanation of what was inside the vault, but the leader just signaled for him to drive. As the van sped away from the sirens, Jake stared out the window, feeling the weight of the journal in his backpack. There was no fortune in that vault, but something told him the true value of that journal far exceeded any amount of money. His mind was still processing what it meant. Why was something so old locked away in a modern vault? And who exactly was interested in it now? The other thieves murmured among themselves, frustrated and disoriented by what they had found. To them, the heist had been a failure. But for Jake, there were more questions to be asked. With the van now speeding through the dark streets, he finally opened the journal again, illuminated by the faint light of the passing street lamps. The pages were filled with symbols, dates, and names, like records from an expedition. On one page, he found a name that made his heart race. Nathaniel Shaw, his own great-grandfather, an explorer who disappeared decades ago, supposedly dead during an expedition. The name was right there, along with a date and coordinates that seemed to indicate a remote location in South America. Jake closed the journal again, trying to process everything. Suddenly, what had started as a simple bank robbery had turned into something personal. There was a hidden legacy here, and he was determined to find out what it meant. The van wound through the dark streets of the city, and as the sound of the sirens faded into the distance, Jake knew his journey was just beginning. The sound of the van's tires screeching against the wet asphalt was the only thing breaking the silence between Jake and the others. The air inside the vehicle felt thick, weighed down by frustration and uncertainty. Donnie stared at Jake, waiting for answers, while Ralph drove silently through the dark streets, with no clear direction. They had planned this heist down to the smallest detail, but what they found didn't make sense to anyone except Jake. With the journal still firmly in his hands, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper here. Something far beyond what they expected to find. His great-grandfather's name, Nathaniel Shaw, was there, buried in the yellowed pages like a shadow from his past. He knew the stories, how Shaw had mysteriously vanished during an expedition in search of a lost treasure, leaving his family in ruins. "Is this a joke, Jake?" Donnie finally broke the silence, his voice tinged with irritation. "We risked our lives for this? An old journal and a rusty key?" Jake ignored him, flipping through the pages with more care this time. Each page seemed to tell a story, but nothing was clear enough. There was a sequence of symbols he couldn't decipher, and on several pages, there were crude maps showing coordinates, but everything seemed coded, except for one date, 1897, and Nathaniel's name. The van slowed down, and Ralph glanced at the rearview mirror, waiting for some kind of command. Jake knew they needed a safe place to lie low for a while. They had prepared a safe house on the outskirts of the city, an old warehouse converted into a hideout for situations like this. Jake nodded, and Ralph steered toward the nearest exit. Once they arrived at the safe house, the group entered in silence. Jake headed straight for a metal table in the center of the room and spread the contents of the journal across it. Donnie and Ralph stood nearby, still suspicious, but not arguing. They knew Jake was meticulous and rarely made mistakes. If he was this fixated on the journal, there had to be something there they hadn't noticed yet. Jake held the bronze key, turning it over in his hands, feeling its weight. Engraved on it, in tiny detail, was the same symbol that appeared in the journal's pages, a circle interwoven with lines that seemed to represent stars. He didn't know what it meant, but something told him this key was the centerpiece of the entire puzzle. "This isn't about money," Jake finally spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "This is much bigger. It's about my great-grandfather's legacy." Donnie frowned, clearly losing patience. "And what does that have to do with us?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Wake up, Jake. We're not here for some wild goose chase into the past. We need something tangible. Cash. Jewels. Not old stories." Jake ignored him again, concentrating on the journal's notes. Between the coordinates and dates, he found references to locations in South America. Apparently, Nathaniel Shaw had been following a trail of clues, searching for a legendary treasure that, according to the journal, had never been found. But the journal ended abruptly, leaving the final pages blank. As if Shaw had disappeared in the middle of his expedition. Questions began to form in Jake's mind. His great-grandfather had been chasing something that many believed to be a legend, but he had come close to finding it. The key, the journal, all of it seemed to point to a specific location. But why had it been locked in that vault in the 21st century? And who was behind all of this now? "This isn't a simple hunt for gold," Jake muttered. "There's something more here. Something far beyond any fortune." Donnie rolled his eyes, exasperated. And what exactly do you plan to do about it? Follow these clues like your great-grandfather and disappear in the middle of nowhere? He sneered, though there was a hint of fear in his voice. The fear that Jake was actually considering it. But Jake wasn't listening to the doubts anymore. He knew he was on the verge of making a decision that could change everything. The journal was the starting point, but the key was the final piece. Something was calling him to follow the trail, even if it meant abandoning everything he knew. He was about to enter uncharted territory, both physically and emotionally. With one last look at the journal, Jake stood up. "I'm going to need you both for this," he said, finally meeting Donnie and Ralph's eyes. The hesitation in the air was palpable, but Jake knew he had no choice. He had found something greater than any amount of money, and he was willing to follow that trail, no matter what dangers lay ahead. The deserted roads stretched out in front of the van, illuminated only by the headlights and the pale moon overhead. Jake continued flipping through the journal, searching for any crucial detail. Each page seemed more cryptic than the last, as if his great-grandfather had left intentional clues, codes that only someone with the right knowledge could unlock. The coordinates and hand-drawn maps pointed to a location in South America, an ancient, forgotten city buried deep within a dense forest. Their first stop, according to the notes, was a small abandoned town hidden deep within the jungle. Jake wasn't sure what they would find there, but one thing was clear: the journal's clues began there, and he couldn't ignore the call. The bronze key still weighed in his pocket, as if it were meant to open something beyond physical doors. Something about it seemed both close and out of reach. As the van followed the increasingly isolated route, Ralph finally broke the silence. "You really think this journal is going to take us somewhere?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Jake looked at him, considering his words before answering. "I don't know where it'll lead, but my great-grandfather was onto something important. It's not a coincidence that this journal was locked in that vault, Ralph. Someone kept it there for a reason." Ralph didn't reply right away. He seemed torn between following Jake on this uncertain journey and the urge to just cut their losses. Donnie, sitting in the back, said nothing, but his expression was clear: he was running out of patience. The entire search was starting to feel like a waste of time to him. Hours later, they finally arrived at the abandoned town. The scene was desolate. Ruins of old buildings, partially overtaken by vegetation, stretched out around them. The silence was almost oppressive, and the night's darkness only made the place more mysterious. Jake stepped out of the van, holding the journal tightly in his hands, while the other two followed him quietly. They walked through the empty streets, their footsteps echoing against the remains of stone and rusted metal. The journal's notes suggested that the next step was to find a specific symbol in the ruins, something that could be the key to unlocking the next riddle. Jake led the group with a flashlight, his eyes scanning every detail around them. Finally, as they turned a corner, he saw it. Carved into an old rock, partially covered by moss, was the same symbol from the journal and the bronze key. The interwoven circle and lines representing stars were right there, in plain sight. Jake stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of the discovery. His heart raced, and he knew instantly that they were on the right path. Donnie stepped closer, frowning as he looked at the symbol. "So what now?" he asked, sarcasm evident in his tone. "We found the symbol. But what does it mean?" Jake didn't answer right away. He pulled the bronze key from his pocket and held it up next to the symbol on the rock. The lines engraved on the key seemed to align perfectly with the design on the stone, like pieces of a larger puzzle. He knew this was more than a coincidence. Ralph stepped forward, analyzing the symbol and the key. "This looks like some kind of marker," he murmured. "Maybe there's something hidden here. Or this is just the beginning." Jake nodded. He knew Ralph was right. This symbol was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and they were still far from uncovering the truth. But the sense of being on the right track was enough to push them forward. There was something buried here, something the journal, the key, and the symbol were all pointing to. "Let's keep going," Jake said, his voice firm. "We're closer than ever." They spent hours exploring the town, searching for any additional clues that might help them understand the next step. But what they found was little more than rubble and ruins. Jake's frustration began to grow, as if the mystery was playing with his patience. However, just as they were about to give up, Jake noticed something peculiar. There was an inscription, almost faded, at the base of one of the oldest buildings. He stepped closer, kneeling down to get a better look. The inscription was a series of numbers and letters, nearly erased by time, but still legible. They were coordinates. And when he compared them to the ones in the journal, he knew instantly that this was the next step. However, just as they were about to give up, Jake noticed something peculiar. There was an inscription, almost faded, at the base of one of the oldest buildings. He stepped closer, kneeling down to get a better look. The inscription was a series of numbers and letters, nearly erased by time, but still legible. They were coordinates. And when he compared them to the ones in the journal, he knew instantly that this was the next step. Jake stood up quickly, showing the coordinates to Ralph and Donnie. "These coordinates lead to the next place," he said, trying to control the excitement in his voice. "The treasure isn't here. But we're close." Donnie looked at him, exhausted but without any other option but to keep going. Ralph, on the other hand, seemed more intrigued than ever. There was something about this discovery that made him believe the journey was just beginning and that the next steps would be even more challenging. They knew they were no longer alone in the search. They could feel it, the sensation of being watched, maybe even followed. But that only made everything more urgent. Jake took one last look at the coordinates carved into the stone. The discovery had injected new energy into the group, though the tension between them was still palpable. He knew that the path ahead would be even more dangerous. While Ralph jotted down the coordinates, Donnie couldn't hide his frustration. The search was starting to push him past his limits, and now, with the unsettling feeling that they were being followed, his patience was wearing thin. "I can't believe we're really following this," Donnie muttered, kicking a rock as they made their way back to the van. "I signed up for easy money, not solving ancient puzzles in the middle of nowhere." Jake ignored the comment, his mind already occupied with the implications of the new coordinates. He knew they were getting closer to whatever his great-grandfather had uncovered. But he also knew they weren't the only ones on this trail. The presence of Vincent King, the businessman pursuing the same prize, weighed heavily on his mind. The van sped off toward their next destination. As they drove down the winding roads, the surrounding landscape became increasingly hostile. The dense forest was intimidating, and the darkness of the night only amplified the feeling of isolation. Jake was focused on the journal, trying to decipher more clues that might guide them, but there was something in the air that made him constantly glance over his shoulder. Ralph, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Do you feel that, Jake?" he asked, his voice low. "Like we're being watched?" Jake nodded without taking his eyes off the journal's pages. He'd felt the same thing since they left the abandoned town. The sense that something, or someone, was following them was undeniable. The roads were empty, but the tension in the air was almost suffocating. "Vincent King," Jake muttered. "He's probably right behind us. Don't underestimate what he's willing to do to get what he wants." Donnie let out a bitter laugh. "Great. Not only are we chasing lost treasures, but now we have to deal with rich psychopaths." The tension mounted as the van hurtled down the isolated road. Jake knew King was dangerous, but he had no idea just how far King would go. All he knew was that they were racing against time. The urgency increased with every mile, and Jake realized the next location was crucial. Something about these new coordinates suggested they were about to enter uncharted territory, a place that hadn't been on any map for decades. As the roads became narrower and more uneven, the forest around them seemed to close in, almost swallowing the path. The feeling of isolation grew stronger, and Jake couldn't help but think about the stories of his great-grandfather. The journal hinted that Nathaniel Shaw had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and now Jake was beginning to understand why. After hours of driving, they finally arrived at the location indicated by the coordinates. It was a clearing deep in the forest, surrounded by tall, dense trees. Jake looked around with suspicion. There were no signs of civilization here. Just the overpowering presence of nature, as if it had been guarding a long-hidden secret. They got out of the van and began exploring the area. Donnie glanced around with disinterest, but Ralph seemed more absorbed than ever in the search. Jake walked slowly through the clearing, scanning every detail. There was something off about the ground. He knelt down and began digging gently with his hands. The soil was soft, as if it had been disturbed recently. Donnie and Ralph moved closer, watching in silence as Jake continued to dig. After a few minutes, he uncovered something. A smooth stone, carved with the same symbol he had seen on the rock and the bronze key. This was the spot the journal had pointed to. "This isn't a coincidence," Ralph murmured, his eyes fixed on the symbol. "We're getting closer." Before they could fully process what they had found, the sound of snapping branches broke the silence. They all turned at once, their bodies tensing. The noise came from within the forest, but it was too close to ignore. Jake immediately reached for his pocket, where he kept a small knife, his only means of defense. Now they knew for sure they were being followed. Vincent King, or someone working for him, must have been tracking them. "We're being hunted," Jake whispered. "We need to move fast." The clearing seemed empty at first glance, but there was something wrong with the soil. Jake knelt again, his instincts telling him there was more beneath the surface. After several minutes of digging, he found something solid, another stone, this one carved with the same symbol as the key. His heart raced. This was the marker they were looking for. "This is it," Jake said, his voice steady. "We need to keep going." Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the clearing, louder and quicker this time. Jake stood up quickly, his senses on high alert. Danger was closing in fast, and they didn't have time to waste. They needed to leave now. "Get back to the van," Jake ordered, already running toward the vehicle. As they sprinted, the footsteps behind them grew louder, faster. The danger was no longer lurking in the shadows. They were being chased, and now, the hunt for the treasure had turned into a fight for survival. The van sped down the narrow, bumpy road, the sounds of the forest gradually fading into distant echoes. Jake's heart was still racing. He knew they had been followed and were now in Vincent King's sights, or at least in the sights of his men. The discovery of the symbol in the clearing wasn't just a clue, it was also a warning that they were on the right path, and others knew it too. Ralph gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the winding road ahead, while Donnie sat in the back, glancing nervously out the window, waiting for someone or something to strike. Jake clutched the journal and the key, reflecting on what they had uncovered. That carved stone with the symbol represented more than just a puzzle. It felt as if they were unearthing a story that had been deliberately buried. "This is getting too dangerous, Jake," Donnie finally spoke up, his voice tense and almost desperate. "King isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants. You know that. And I didn't sign up to die over some damn journal." Jake took a deep breath, his gaze still fixed on the horizon as the van rounded a sharp curve. He knew Donnie was partially right. Vincent King wasn't someone to be underestimated. He was ruthless, and now that he knew Jake and his crew were ahead of him, he would do anything to eliminate them. But Jake also knew they were too close to give up. The journal, the key, the symbol on the stone, everything was leading them to something bigger. "We're not giving up now," Jake replied firmly, not turning to face Donnie. "If King is this desperate to find it, that means we're on the right track." Donnie grumbled something under his breath and turned back to staring out the window. The tension within the group was thick, and Jake knew that as they got closer to the truth, the pressure would only increase. He could feel Ralph and Donnie beginning to question his leadership, but he also knew neither of them was willing to walk away from the search just yet. After hours on the road, they finally arrived at a small village deep in the mountains, almost hidden between the ridges. The place looked deserted, as if time had stopped decades ago. The stone houses were covered in moss, and only a few dim lights flickered in the windows. Jake knew this was where the next phase of their search would begin. The journal mentioned an ancient structure, a temple hidden in the nearby mountains, and he believed that was where they would find the next step. They parked the van in a secluded area near a dense forest and got out. Jake scanned the area, noticing the exhaustion on the others' faces. He knew the group was close to breaking, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The mountains loomed ahead, shrouded in mist that hid whatever lay beyond. As they hiked toward the trail leading into the mountains, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the presence of King and his men that worried him. There was something more. An invisible shadow, as if the land itself was against them. The forest around them felt denser and more oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified in the night's silence. When they reached the start of the trail, Donnie suddenly stopped. He was panting, and his expression was one of pure panic. "I'm not going any further, Jake," he said, his voice low but firm. "This has gone too far. King is hunting us down. We're in the middle of a forest with no idea what we're looking for. I'm not dying out here over a treasure that might not even exist." Jake stared at him, feeling the tension in the air rise. He knew Donnie was on the verge of abandoning them, and that could be disastrous. If Donnie left and tried to return, he'd likely end up in King's hands. And if he were captured, there was no doubt he would give up everything he knew. "Donnie, we're close," Jake tried to reason with him, keeping his voice calm. "If you leave now, King will find you. You know that. The only safe way is to keep moving forward." Donnie glanced around, the thick forest seeming to close in on him. For a moment, Jake thought he might relent, but instead, Donnie took a step back. "I'm not dying for this," he muttered, turning abruptly and heading back toward the van. Ralph tried to stop him, but Donnie ignored him, moving quickly away from the group. Jake stood still, watching Donnie's shadow disappear into the darkness. "He's going to betray us," Ralph said quietly, his expression dark. "King's going to get him." Jake knew Ralph was right. Donnie was scared and exhausted, and now he was alone, vulnerable. It was only a matter of time before he fell into Vincent King's hands. And when that happened, all the information they had uncovered would be compromised. Jake clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. The journey was becoming more treacherous than he had anticipated, and now, with Donnie out of the picture, their chances of success had diminished. But he couldn't give up. Not now. He looked at Ralph, the only one still by his side, and knew they had to keep going, no matter the risk. "We keep moving forward," Jake said, his voice resolute. "Before King catches up to us." The silence between Jake and Ralph was heavy as they followed the narrow, winding trail into the mountains. The shadow of Donnie's betrayal still hung over them, but there was no turning back now. Jake knew that Donnie was probably already in Vincent King's hands, and that soon enough, King would know exactly where they were. That only made the urgency to press on even stronger. The cold mountain air made each breath more difficult, and the thick fog that wrapped around the dense forest seemed to grow more oppressive with every step. Jake clutched the bronze key tightly in one hand, its cold metal a constant reminder of the importance of their mission. The key, the symbol, the journal, all of it was intertwined in a web of secrets that he was only beginning to unravel. His great-grandfather, Nathaniel Shaw, had disappeared in this very region, following the same trail, and now Jake was starting to realize that what they were searching for wasn't just a physical treasure. It was something more. Something far more dangerous. Ralph glanced over at Jake, holding the flashlight up to illuminate the path ahead. "What exactly are we looking for?" Ralph asked, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "This has gone way beyond a simple treasure hunt." "What is this, Jake?" Jake hesitated for a moment, his mind still processing the information from the journal. He knew what they were after wasn't gold or jewels. This was something much bigger. Nathaniel Shaw's journal contained references to a discovery that could change the balance of global power. A secret that, if revealed, could topple governments, ruin influential figures, and cause global chaos. "This isn't about gold or riches," Jake finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "My great-grandfather was chasing something bigger. A discovery that could change the course of history." The journal mentions secret documents, information that could bring down entire governments. Ralph stopped walking for a moment, processing what Jake had just said. There was something different in the tone of Jake's voice, something that suggested they were stepping into something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. "We're talking about state secrets?" Ralph asked, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "This is serious, Jake. If this is true, King isn't the only problem we're going to face. This could bring much worse." Jake nodded slowly. He knew Ralph was right. If what the journal suggested was true, then there was more at stake than just a race against King. Powerful figures could be involved, and they were walking straight into dangerous territory. But there was no turning back now. Jake felt that his great-grandfather had come close to discovering something that was never meant to be found, and he was determined to finish what Nathaniel had started. "I know," Jake said. "But we don't have a choice now. We're committed. And we're close to finding what Nathaniel was after. This key and the journal are the last pieces of the puzzle." They continued down the trail, and with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just the presence of King and his men that haunted them now. There was something in the land itself, as if it was aware of their every move. The towering trees blocked out the natural light, and the only thing illuminating their path was Ralph's weak flashlight. After hours of trekking, they reached an elevated point on the trail, where they could see the vastness of the forest below. The wind whipped around them, cold and sharp, and in the distance, they saw it, a large stone structure, partially covered by overgrown vegetation. It was almost invisible at first, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the temple mentioned in the journal. A chill ran down Jake's spine as he saw it. That ancient building, buried deep in the heart of the mountains, was the key to everything. He knew whatever they were searching for was inside. "This is it," Jake said, his voice almost drowned out by the wind. "Whatever my great-grandfather was after, it's in there." They made their way down the trail toward the temple, their flashlights casting beams of light across the ancient stone walls, etched with old inscriptions and symbols that mirrored the one on the key. The place looked like a forgotten sanctuary, but at the same time, it felt unsettling. As if this place had been abandoned for a reason. Ralph ran his hand along one of the stone walls, carefully tracing the symbols with his fingers. "This looks like some kind of protection system," he commented. "Like it's guarding something. Or keeping something locked inside." Jake didn't respond. His focus was on the entrance of the temple, a narrow, dark opening that seemed both inviting and threatening. He knew once they entered, there was no turning back. They were a step away from uncovering the truth, but also a step closer to the danger that had consumed his great-grandfather. Holding the bronze key in his hand, Jake approached the entrance. He knew the moment of truth was close. This key, passed down through generations, was now about to unlock the secret that had been kept hidden for so long. He turned to Ralph, who stood silently, watching with a mixture of doubt and fear. "Are we ready for this?" Jake asked, gripping the key tightly. Ralph nodded, and together, they stepped into the temple, knowing they were about to face the unknown. The interior of the temple was dark and cramped, the air thick and heavy. Ralph's flashlight cut through the blackness, revealing walls carved with ancient symbols that seemed to watch them. Jake took a deep breath, the musty smell of mold and dampness filling his senses. Every step echoed against the stone, creating the eerie feeling that they weren't alone. Jake gripped the bronze key tightly in his hand as he moved through the narrow corridor. The place was far older than he had imagined, and everything about it suggested it was built not just to hide something, but to keep something locked away. The sense of imminent danger was palpable. His great-grandfather's journal hinted that this temple held the secret he had been searching for, but it offered no clue about what waited behind the doors. Ralph scanned the surroundings nervously, his footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. The constant drip of water from somewhere deep inside the temple only added to the oppressive silence. He paused for a moment, shining the light on the carvings along the walls. "I don't think we should be here, Jake," Ralph said, his voice low and uncertain in the corridor. "This place, it looks like it was left this way for a reason. Like no one is supposed to find what's hidden here." Jake didn't answer immediately. He knew Ralph was right. But they were too close to turn back now. The sound of their footsteps grew louder, as if the walls themselves were trying to warn them. And then, ahead of them, they saw a large stone door, worn down by time. Engraved in the center of the door was the same symbol from the key, perfectly etched, as if it had been waiting for them. "This is it," Jake murmured, his eyes fixed on the door. "Whatever my great-grandfather was looking for is behind this door." He stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he pulled out the bronze key and fitted it into the ancient lock. A dry click echoed through the temple, and then, slowly, the door began to creak open. The sound of stone grinding against stone filled the air, and a cold breeze swept through the corridor, as though something long dormant had just been awakened. Jake and Ralph stepped cautiously into the chamber beyond the door. The space was vast, much larger than any other part of the temple they had seen. In the center of the room was a stone table, and on top of it sat an old wooden chest, covered in intricate carvings. Around the room, stone shelves held piles of documents, dust-covered and worn by time. The atmosphere was suffocating, as though the very air was thick with the weight of the secrets kept here. "This is the treasure?" Ralph asked, clearly disappointed. "Old documents?" Jake approached the chest, knowing that the real treasure lay inside. He carefully lifted the lid, and what he saw inside made him stop for a moment. Pages and pages of notes, diagrams, and letters were piled inside, some of them bearing his great-grandfather's name, Nathaniel Shaw. And among the papers was a folder, one that looked distinctly out of place. It was a dossier, marked with the seal of a government agency Jake didn't recognize. Jake lifted the folder, feeling the weight of his discovery. He opened it slowly and saw that it contained official documents, secrets that, if revealed, would cause global disaster. There were records of government conspiracies, corporate fraud, and powerful figures involved in covert operations. This was the true treasure, not gold, but information. Information that could topple entire governments and destabilize the world. This was what Nathaniel Shaw had been chasing. This could change everything, Jake whispered, realizing the magnitude of what he was holding. Before he could say more, a noise behind them made him freeze. Footsteps. They were no longer alone. Jake turned quickly, and his suspicions were confirmed. Vincent King stood at the entrance to the chamber, a triumphant smile on his face. He wasn't alone. His men flanked him, armed and ready for any resistance. "I told you wouldn't be able to get away from me, Jake," King said, his voice smooth but filled with menace. "I knew you'd be useful in finding this. I just needed to give you enough time." Jake clenched his fists, frustration building inside him. He had known King would be following them, but he hadn't expected him to catch up this fast. Now, with the dossier in his hands, Jake knew he was in a precarious position. King wanted the dossier, and Jake couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. He knew what King would do with that information. The destruction, the chaos he could cause with those secrets, was unimaginable. "You're not getting this, King," Jake said, trying to stay calm. "You don't know what these documents represent." King laughed, taking a few steps forward, his eyes locked on the folder in Jake's hands. "Oh, I know exactly what they represent," he replied. "Power. And more than that, control. Control over governments, over markets, over the fate of entire nations. That's the real treasure. And you think I'm going to let it slip through my fingers?" Jake knew he was outmatched. King had his men, and he and Ralph were unarmed, with no chance of fighting back physically. But there was one thing Jake still had: knowledge. He knew the contents of those documents, and he knew the stakes. If King got hold of them, the entire world would pay the price. "It doesn't matter what you do, King," Jake said, his voice steady. "These documents will never see the light of day. I won't let you have them." King took another step forward, his eyes darkening. "And how do you plan to stop me?" Jake glanced at the folder in his hands and, without hesitation, tore the first page in half. King froze, his eyes widening for a moment before he lunged forward, but Jake was already ripping apart the rest of the documents. Each piece of paper disintegrated into nothing, while King screamed in rage. "You're destroying everything!" King shouted, trying to rush forward, but Ralph held him back, shoving him away. Jake knew there was no other choice. He couldn't let those secrets fall into King's hands. With the papers destroyed, the true treasure was lost forever, but at least he had prevented the chaos they could have caused. King staggered back, furious but realizing there was nothing more he could do. He cast one last look at Jake before ordering his men to retreat. "This isn't over, Jake," he said, his voice dripping with threat. And with that, Vincent King disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake and Ralph alone in the temple, surrounded by the remains of secrets that would never see the light of day. The sound of Vincent King's footsteps and those of his men faded into the distance, leaving Jake and Ralph surrounded by the echoing silence of the temple. The shredded remains of the documents lay scattered on the stone floor, and the air seemed lighter now, as if the weight of the secrets they had uncovered had finally been lifted. But at the same time, the gravity of what they had just destroyed hung heavily in the atmosphere. Jake knew that the real treasure, the truth, had been lost, but it was a price they had to pay to prevent the world from spiraling into chaos. Ralph approached Jake, still in shock from what had just happened. He looked at the torn-up pages strewn around them, his eyes lingering on the now illegible fragments. "I can't believe you did that," he murmured, his voice a mix of admiration and disbelief. "All that power, destroyed." Jake sighed, his body finally relaxing after the hours of accumulated tension. He knew what he had done was necessary. Vincent King could never be allowed to have those documents. But there was something else. Something that still didn't quite sit right with him. The legacy of his great-grandfather, Nathaniel Shaw, was deeply connected to those secrets, and now, Jake felt that Shaw's mission had, in a way, been fulfilled. "I didn't have a choice, Ralph," Jake replied, his gaze fixed on the scattered pieces of paper. "If King had gotten what he wanted, the entire world would have suffered. This wasn't something that could be left in anyone's hands." Ralph shook his head, as if still trying to process everything. The impact of their discovery and its destruction hadn't fully settled yet. He ran his hands through his hair, looking around the chamber, the stone walls still marked with symbols that seemed to guard secrets far older than they could comprehend. "So now what?" he asked, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "What do we do now?" Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. Everything they had gone through, the entire search for Nathaniel Shaw's treasure, had led to this moment. The documents were destroyed, his great-grandfather's legacy partially revealed and yet lost at the same time, and the constant threat of King still loomed. But there was something else. A sense that, despite everything, there was still something left to discover. He bent down and picked up one of the remaining fragments that had survived the destruction. Most of the contents had been torn apart, but a small sentence caught his eye. It was a note, handwritten by Nathaniel Shaw himself, scribbled in the margin of one of the pages. Jake read the words quietly to himself, his heart beginning to race again. "Not all is lost." Jake looked up at Ralph, a newfound energy running through him. "This isn't over yet," he said, holding the fragment of paper up. "My great-grandfather left something behind. Something King didn't get. I think we can still find it." Ralph frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "We destroyed everything. There's nothing left." Jake shook his head, standing up with renewed determination. "Not everything," he replied, showing Ralph the handwritten note. "Not all is lost. My great-grandfather wrote this. He knew something might go wrong. He prepared for this." Ralph's eyes widened as he began to understand what Jake was saying. "You think he left another clue? Something King didn't find?" Jake nodded. He knew his great-grandfather had been too meticulous to not account for the possibility that things could go awry. Nathaniel Shaw, during his expedition, had planned every move carefully. He knew the forces pursuing him were too dangerous to leave everything in one place. There was more. Another secret waiting to be unearthed. "We need to get out of here," Jake said quickly, slipping the fragment into his pocket. "King could come back, and we don't have any time to waste. There's more to this, and we're going to find it." Ralph didn't hesitate. He knew that, despite everything they had been through, the search wasn't over yet. There was something more waiting for them, something that could finally bring closure to Nathaniel Shaw's legacy. They quickly left the temple, their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors as the cold mountain wind hit them once again. The sky was growing darker, and the distant sound of an approaching storm rumbled ominously, as if nature itself was warning them to move quickly. The van was still parked where they had left it, and with one final glance at the temple, Jake and Ralph got in and drove off, leaving the eerie structure behind. As they drove back down the winding mountain road, the silence between them was almost comforting. Ralph focused on the road, while Jake stared out the window, his mind racing with everything that still lay ahead. The note from his great-grandfather kept playing over and over in his mind. "Not all is lost." He knew those words weren't just a message of hope. They were an instruction, a clue for the next step. As the city lights appeared on the horizon, Jake pulled the journal from his bag once more, carefully flipping through its pages. He knew that somewhere within the remaining pages, there would be more clues. More secrets buried in Nathaniel Shaw's carefully chosen words. And he was right. As he reached the final pages of the journal, something new caught his attention. A new set of coordinates, written in lighter ink, almost as if they had been added after the rest of the journal had been completed. Coordinates pointing to an entirely different location. A place Nathaniel Shaw had never mentioned before. Jake smiled, closing the journal with a sense of purpose. I think we've just found our next destination. Ralph glanced at him in the rearview mirror, noticing the spark of excitement in Jake's eyes. You're serious? He asked, with a mix of surprise and weariness. Jake nodded, the excitement building in his chest once again. We're just getting started, Ralph. There are still more secrets to uncover. And with that, the van drove off into the distance, the strong winds of the approaching storm pushing them toward the unknown. Nathaniel Shaw's legacy was far from over, and Jake knew that there was still much more to be revealed, secrets that could once again change everything.